From the lowest slaves to the highest-ranking ministers, for almost 4,000 years, eunuchs were a presence in courts across the world. As a social class of trusted servants, eunuchs served Egyptian pharaohs, Chinese emperors, Middle Eastern kings, caliphates, and sultans, and in many places became well-respected confidants, advisors, generals, and patriarchs. But their unique position often led to their ability to amass great power. At their height in Imperial China during the Middle Ages, the eunuchs were the kingmakers. They became feared masters of court intrigue, open to corruption, interfering with politics, selecting successors, and able to destroy their enemies to keep themselves strong. The origins of eunuchs date all the way back to the 21st century BC, to the Sumerian region of Mesopotamia. Over the centuries that followed, they appeared throughout the Middle East as slaves and servants, in the Assyrian Empire and the early Persian empires, for example. But by the 3rd century BC, their usefulness in higher positions had become apparent, particularly in Imperial China. They were established as a respected and common social class, trusted in the royal court, operating in administrative and domestic roles in a society built on the idea of dynastic family rule. By the Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century AD, eunuchs were some of the most powerful men in the country, sometimes even more so than the emperor. For thousands of years, castration was used to keep slaves loyal, or as a punishment for imprisoned rivals and those caught having affairs with the wives of prominent men. But in China, it was also a way for rulers to ensure servants could remain trusted while in their palace. By removing a man's ability to procreate, rulers felt reassured that they were safe from the threat of a rising dynasty, while also knowing their own wives and concubines were safe. The favor and opportunity available to a Chinese eunuch resulted in many young men voluntarily castrating themselves so they could access a career in court they would otherwise be restricted. Elsewhere, in Christian Europe, eunuchs had a more complicated role. Chastity was seen as morally ideal, meaning eunuchs were perceived positively as devout and pure. Some religious figures chose to be castrated as a practical demonstration of their freedom from sin. But they were also considered immoral for lacking the essential parts of a man and seen as a foreign import that should be viewed with suspicion, and rarely found themselves rising beyond the role of slaves or domestic servants. In the Byzantine and Abbasid empires, men were sometimes castrated to allow them to become generals and religious patriarchs, with their castration intended to eliminate their possibility of rising up to become an emperor themselves. Their status and reputations across the world were complicated and often contradictory, despised and admired, trusted and mistrusted, weakened by their castration, but also immensely powerful by the opportunities available to them. A day in the life of a eunuch varied depending on where in the world they were found and their status within that society. In Europe and the Middle East, a typical eunuch was a domestic servant or slave whose day consisted of completing mundane tasks within the ruler's home. They would make the ruler's bed, bathe him, clean his bedchambers, and pass messages back and forth across the palace. But in Imperial China, eunuchs had the opportunity to rise above the ranks of a servant and amass significant power of their own. While the Chinese emperor sat on the throne ruling a gigantic empire containing millions of people, they always had to be wary of rivals looking to snatch that power away. The ruling dynasty held a mandate of heaven, giving them and their family holy justification to rule, meaning a seated emperor would likely rule until his death, choosing one of his own sons to then take his place. With the rewards so great, backstabbing, conspiracy, and desperate grabs for power among rivals were all common. This environment allowed eunuchs to rise in importance to Chinese society. From a class of slaves in the 6th century, they became a vital hierarchy of trusted men operating as servants, administrators, and political advisors. Knowing they could not procreate and form a legitimate rival dynasty to challenge them, the emperor could trust his eunuchs. This turned the eunuch class from one of societal shame and emasculation into a desirable career path for many. To gain employment at the imperial palace, castration was mandatory, and young men were happy to do so voluntarily. Not only could they access opportunity and political power by becoming a eunuch, but also a far better quality of life within the palace. They became a societal class all on their own, with high-ranking eunuchs having direct access to the emperor, with some having control of armies, naval fleets, and great riches. Those further down the pecking order, meanwhile, were common servants operating in the imperial palace. A lowly eunuch was responsible for the everyday routine of palace life, trusted to prepare meals for the imperial family, protect the harem of women, clean the palace, take part in construction projects, and carry the emperor in his wheelless carriage known as a litter. Spending so much time in court near the emperor would inevitably lead to eunuchs hearing information via messages they transferred back and forth, or from overhearing private conversations. This allowed the most manipulative of them to use their information in nefarious ways, and some were employed by rivals as domestic spies. The higher-ranking eunuchs, meanwhile, would have a more administrative role, completing tasks directly for the emperor, relaying important messages, and seeing that his orders were carried out. Acting as a conduit of the emperor's authority gave these eunuchs power of their own, and the air of importance within society. But with this power and status came envy and hatred amongst their rivals in court. The status of a eunuch became a complicated one. On one hand, they were considered trustworthy and loyal, but on the other, they were known to be capable of court intrigue and were willing to do whatever it took to maintain their own power. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, the ruling dynasty was the Tang, and it was here that the eunuchs reached the apex of their power, with 2 examples showing their growing status. In 757, the rebel An Lushan attempted to overthrow the Tang and forge his own dynasty in its place. Years prior, An Lushan castrated a servant and kept him close, as he had moderate success against the Tang in the year-long rebellions he instigated. But as he grew cruel and started favoring one son over another, his eunuch was approached by An Lushan's rejected son and hired to kill him. Using his position of trust and close proximity, the eunuch entered An Lushan's room one evening and stabbed him to death. Ultimately, the rebellion was taken over by his son and was crushed by the Tang. But this sort of intrigue has come to define eunuch's role in history. The other example comes several decades later, in 835 AD. Known as the Sweet Dew Incident, the embittered Tang emperor conspired against his court of powerful eunuchs and tried to have them killed. Along with his chancellor and top generals, he hatched a scheme to trick the eunuchs to come out into the open, where they could be slaughtered by his army. Around 10 eunuchs were killed, but many of them were able to escape by carrying the emperor on his litter to safety indoors. With the plot a failure, the groveling emperor was insulted and cursed by the eunuchs, who ordered the execution of many of the people responsible for the conspiracy against them. Over 1,000 officials were killed in the aftermath, as the eunuchs tightened their grip on power. For the rest of the Tang rule, the eunuchs controlled the country by deciding on the succession of emperors most convenient to them, and were the de facto rulers of China. Eunuchs remained common in the Chinese court right through to the 20th century when the final dynasty fell. But by then, they had returned to their servant roles, often mistreated, abused, and maligned. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. No castration required.